Join me for an ongoing conversation around the issues shaping and transforming Houston, as we explore their impact with some of our city's most innovative and creative leaders of our time. Welcome to this week's episode of Conversations. I'm your host, Larry Payne. So glad to have you join us for this week's show. The life and vitality of a city and a region is known basically by the Civic Health Index, the Civic Health Index in which it possesses. I have a special guest with us today that's going to look at this issue in depth, but let me kind of frame what we're going to be talking about. Civic health refers to the way that communities are organized to define and address public problems. Communities with strong indicators of civic health have higher employment rates, stronger schools, better physical health, and more responsive governments. This study analyzes the civic health of the greater Houston region through three dimensions: social connectiveness, civic involvement, and political participation. Joining me is John Lappie, who is a post-doctoral federal researcher with the Kinder Institute for Urban Research. That's a mouthful. Post-doctoral research fellow with the Kinder Institute for Urban Research. Welcome, John.
Thank you. It could be even bigger mouthful. with the post-doctoral research associate for the Center for Localized American Politics at the Kinder Institute for Urban Research at Rice University.
Thank you very much.
That's half the segment already.
For all of that. We've made the plug for all the organizations. So Houston gets poor ratings, though, on our civic health.
It does. If I had to give it a letter grade, I guess I would say a C.
Okay.
It could be worse, right? It does score well on some indicators, but in general, it's below average. If you take 21 key indicators of civic health, the average ranking was 36 out of the 50 largest metro areas in the United States.
36 out of 50. So we're 36 out of 56.
Yeah.
It's not good.
No, it's not very good.
Not for the fourth largest urban city in America.
No, definitely not. Definitely not. It's clearly major challenge to civic health in this community.
And so if we look at civic health, which is an important thing for us to observe, the Houston Public Library, as I mentioned, you've been doing this wonderful series on connecting communities for critical conversations. And what we found for doing that now on the civic engagement for about 3 years in different forms is that the number one thing that your survey, your index found is what we've also been tracking, the lack of trust.
That's right. Yeah, about 45-ish% of people in greater Houston, that's the metro area, not just the city, right, but the whole metro area, about 45% trust most or all of their neighbors, and that's about 12 points lower than the national average. And among the 50 largest metro areas, Houston ranks 42nd out of 50 on trust. And this is a major problem because you can think about people don't trust each other, then they're not going to work with each other to help overcome their community problems. They're just not going to.
Right. And trust is such a critical factor, we found out, because the way it has framed itself, developing relationships built on mutual trust and respect, because nothing happens without trust.
That's right.
And the thing about trust in those relationships, you have to have the trust developed before you need it. Not in the middle of the issue, not in the middle of the tension, not in the middle of the discussion. You have to take the time to nurture, create, support, and maintain those relationships.
That's absolutely right. Yeah, absolutely. And with trust being so low, it's hard to see. I mean, we have lots of problems in this community, and if people don't trust each other, then we're never going to overcome these issues.
Well, our urban public education system is a good example.
Right.
The lack of trust with HISD, from administrators to board, we find ourselves now in a situation where it doesn't matter what anybody says.
Right.
There's no trust because you've never done anything that you said you were going to do over the years.
Right.
So how do we get out of that?
On the broad level, trust is a hard problem to fix. So this report emphasizes it's a descriptive report. Right. So I can't make any causal claims about what's causing all this. So what I'm about to say is sort of speculative. So take it for what it's worth.
Okay.
Right? It's just speculative. Right. The major causes of distrust we tend to find are things like poverty, crime, some would argue racial heterogeneity or diversity, though the findings on that are kind of mixed and nuanced, and inequality. And these are all problems that Houston tends to have, and they're not easy problems to fix. There's no quick solution to these issues.
So if we don't trust and we have distrust, we don't work together, we don't participate together. We don't come collaboratively together to work on our issues and problems and solutions.
Right.
If now, in HISD's case, we're in the second era of the resegregation
That's right.
of public schools, only 7.9% of Anglo kids left in HISD out of 214,000 kids.
Right.
In the second era of resegregation, what was present in the first era of segregation, because I went to segregated schools, I'm old enough to have, there was a lot of trust.
Right.
There was a lot of cooperation in the neighborhood, in the community, from not only persons of color, but from Anglos, Caucasians, white people.
Yeah.
If we have that environment now where you need it the most in this time of poverty and in the second era of segregation, if we don't have the trust, that almost is a stopping point to move forward on any issue.
That's absolutely right. Yeah, absolutely.
So we do need to back up a minute and say, look, we got to get people together first.
That's right. Yeah, I think that's absolutely right, because talk about this low level of trust, right? It's not that people don't trust anybody, right? They might trust their friends, coworkers. They trust some people. The problem is they don't trust people generically. They don't trust the people they don't know in their community, right? If they don't know them personally, then their default, for most people, the default in Houston is distrust them. Right?
Okay.
And really, you're talking about a city of this size, right? It can't just be, I mean, if it was a small town, right, then, and you knew most of your neighbors, if it was Morgan's Point, right, it's like 200 people live there, right, then, yeah, you could know most of your neighbors, you can have a personal relationship, and you can overcome problems that way. But in a city this size, you need that generic trust. You need to trust people who you don't know, or else, yeah, we're really not going to get anything done.
So if we do not have the ability to see each other as human beings without any other labels.
That's right.
If we have kind of steered away from the 5 tenets of what it means to be a citizen living in democracy, which is, you and I talked about, is first the individual rights and privileges discussion. Everybody loves that discussion because that's about I and me, right?
Right.
The other 3 are common duties, obligations, responsibilities to whom? The other. Define the other in society today, someone different than myself, someone that does not look like me. But in fact, that's the we and us discussion.
Right.
So how do we get to we and us? Because we seem to be locked into this I and me thing.
That's absolutely true. The key really from the, again, the findings are a bit nuanced in this literature, right?
I know I'm pushing it.
In terms of like simple, the finding that more diverse communities tend to have lower levels of trust, right? This can be mitigated by simply interacting with your neighbors, especially neighbors of different backgrounds, right? Now, not just any kind of interaction, right? If the interactions are negative, then that's not going to change your change your opinion. But if you have positive interactions with the people you share your neighborhood with, that builds those trusts. But it really does require this sort of interpersonal connection. We need to actually interact with each other.
Hold that thought. We're going to talk about positive connections. We're going to take a small pause and break here, and we'll be right back. And pick up on this positive interaction between friends and neighbors. Stay tuned. We'll be right back. Left off right before the break talking about positive interaction with the other. Positive interactions beyond just the cultural norms of sharing food together and dance and all those things. We've kind of passed that. We got to get to the real issues, which is this thing we have to get away from in this country, in this city, in this state, about tolerance. Yes, we used to teach tolerance. Tolerance was the lowest bar that you had to overcome in dealing with the other. I always say in Texas, I tolerate the roaches, the ants, the mosquitoes, and the heat. I don't want to put a human being on the same level of something I just tolerate. Never going to love or even like, just tolerate. It's about acceptance, right?
Yeah.
It's about trying to move to really understanding how to accept the other human being in front of me that may be different from myself. And then the second part, which gets to your index, and how to help and serve them as my fellow citizen, as my fellow human being.
Yeah.
That's not happening.
No.
Except in times of emergencies. Everybody be clear, we're not talking about a Harvey incident. Because people rose to the occasion during that time. Everybody was our brothers and sisters. We saved and helped everybody. And as soon as that kind of waned and went away, they went away.
Exactly. We've, in this report, found like 21 21% of people in the metro area say they volunteer annually to help out the less fortunate in their community. It's
just 21%?
Just 21%. Now, that is through an organization, so if they're doing it less formally, it might not count. And that's 4 points lower than the national average, right? So better than we were doing on trust, but still below the national average. Now, I'm sure that's going to spike the next time they run that survey, which is post-Harvey. You know, it's going to be a lot of people saying they volunteered.
Exactly.
And, you know, that's great, right? It's great people were volunteering to help. I'm glad to know that I live in a place where if I'm flooded in my own home, somebody will come out with a boat and get out. That's good to know, right? But in terms of the future of civic health, or the future of volunteerism, the thing is, people who volunteer during disasters are from a broader variety of backgrounds than people who volunteer during quote-unquote normal times, right?
And you need them in normal times.
Exactly. Yeah, it's like everybody wants to help out during a disaster, and that's great, but there's a lot of people suffering who need help between major flooding events, and granted, a major flooding event's like once a year here now, but people need a lot of help in between, and it's just not happening.
And because it's not happening, the dependency on philanthropy and charity to fill that gap is greater, and that is even down. The charitable giving and philanthropy is down. And so there's a gap there in trying to fill the gap to help the poor and the needy. Where does it come from? Before you answer, I just want to say one point on that.
Sure.
I think we've relied and do rely too much on charity without having discussions about justice. Without talking about even social justice. We love to do the immediate thing. It makes us feel good. It gives us gratification. The larger, harder work is to look at systemic change, eradication, policy change, legislative changes. We don't tend to do that.
No, we don't. People, and you know, if you personally help out, donate some money, like, that's great, right? It's good. You should do that. But yeah, larger changes require broader, usually, or more often than not, political
That's that
changes.
Civic participation, right?
Right. Yeah, usually across something broader. And frankly, it's something, you know, beyond what necessarily the individual person can do by themselves, right? We need to work together politically or non-politically, but it requires work from multiple people, lots of people, not just what you can do on your lonesome.
And then again, the lowest bar of that involvement and participation is voting, and we don't even vote.
No. It's about 40% in a midterm election, 60% in a presidential, and that's of registered voters, and not everybody is registered to vote. If we're looking at mayoral elections, it's more like the teens. It spiked to a little over a quarter in 2015. I'm not sure if that was due to the highly competitive election that year or the HERO ordinance spiking turnout. So yes, turnout, not everybody is voting, not everybody is registering, and we see disproportionate participation there. Naturalized citizens, for example, a large proportion of the area's population, right? They're about 7 percentage points less likely to be registered to vote than native-born citizens. The turnout rate among voters with Hispanic surnames is consistently lower than the overall registered turnout rate in November elections in Harris County. About 14% lower in 2014, down to only about 8% lower in 2016, possibly due to the controversial, shall we say, nature of the presidential election that year.
So, if demography is destiny, which it is, if the numerical changes in Harris County and Houston is growing to be more and more everyday Hispanic, Latino population, predominant group, everybody in Houston is a minority. Everybody in Harris County soon will be a minority. You've got to put two groups together to get a majority of anything, right? So if all minorities and the predominant group of the majority are persons of color, and the majority of the persons of color are Hispanic and Latino who aren't registered and don't vote, where are we going?
Well, it means our politics are not going to reflect the population, right? People who are elected will, you know, reflect the interests and beliefs of voters. It's a fallacy to think that politicians don't care about what people think. It's they care about what voters think.
Exactly, and there is a difference.
There's absolutely a difference. They will be responsive to voters, and if you don't vote, either they won't care, or you know they're just elected by people who do vote, and so they share their opinions, they share their interest, right? And you have to worry about what it's going to mean for substantive policy in the future.
Well, look, and again, the school board races are,
Right.
that's the lowest voter turnout. School board races don't even make it to the...
Yeah, it's like, what was it, 9%
Yeah,
of
don't even
registered
make it to
voters
the double
2017?
digits.
Right, that's going to be the new normal in school board elections that aren't held simultaneously with the mayoral election.
I think we'll get smart one year and put them on the same time.
Yeah.
The other point I think to make before we have to take the next little break here is to look at this issue of motivation.
Yeah.
What motivates people? What the professionals will tell you is that you can motivate a person to come out if they're fearful they're going to lose something rather than gain something. It's easier to get turnout if you feel you're going to lose something than to vote positively for something you may gain through a new legislation.
That's true. Yeah.
And so the fear factor in the world of distrust already, therefore is able to really be really mounted on top of that, and then you get what you have.
Exactly. And it is unfortunately true that people are more fearful of losing something than they are hopeful about gaining something. People always react more to the threat of loss than the hope of gain. And think about that in terms of distrust, right? So trust is linked to a whole host of other civically healthy behaviors, but not as much to political participation, right? Okay. And I think that's because, this is speculative on my part, but I would argue that's probably because people who are the fear factor, right, is how people vote even though they don't trust their neighbors, maybe even because they don't trust their neighbors, will motivate them to vote.
Yeah. And it's a classic kind of thing, even Dr. King addressed it, and this is interesting, on the 5th anniversary of his assassination, we're having this conversation. It's the classic question of who's my neighbor?
Right.
And how to define who's my neighbor.
Yeah.
And it's also, as we go to break, it's also the question of how and what is the threshold for human beings? We haven't even...
No.
There ought to be, what is a fair ethical treatment of all human beings just because they're human beings? All human beings' lives matter. All human beings' lives are equal. That discussion is the one, that's the ethical question, right?
Right.
We'll pick up that when we come back, because part of that lies in these 3 points of civic index. We'll be right back. Before the break, we were talking about elections and voter turnout and the dismal numbers on voter turnout. But there's an interesting point on that we didn't get to touch on. That's uncontested races, which is even another phenomenon.
That's absolutely right. We talk a lot, we study a lot about voter turnout.
Right.
And in academia, it's because we're usually studying presidential elections, which are they're not going to be uncontested. Right. But from the local level, lots of elections are unopposed. We did a study of local elections across 6 states. It wasn't a random sample, across 6 states, cities of all size, and about half of mayoral elections were unopposed, right? So Houston's a little bit better on that indicator. We didn't have an unopposed mayoral election. Some of those Bill White ones, it's kind of a technicality that it wasn't unopposed. Like over 90% for Bill White. So, but a surprisingly large number of other elections in the county are uncontested. Only about 1/10 of the at-large seats for the city council, closer to 1/4 to 1/3 of the seats for the district seats in the city council. And what I find most surprising, 40% of elections for the county commissioners court were uncontested from 2004 to 2016. You think about it, it's like each of those districts has over 1 million residents.
Yes, they do.
And only one person ran. And especially they're partisan elections, right? And you would think that the parties would have a vested interest in recruiting somebody to run. Even if you think that you're probably not going to win, the recent example of Roy Moore in Alabama shows you should run somebody in case. But we're not
put a familiar name on the ballot.
Put a warm body who won't disgrace you, and if something happens, then maybe you can win, right? And we talk a lot about turnout, and turnout is dismally low, right? But we got to think that turnout doesn't. How many people vote isn't all that important if they have nothing to vote on. If there are no choices to make on election day, then really who cares how many people are voting, right? And we have to consider that, especially about an off-cycle election, for people to vote on an unusual day. What reason do they have to vote if the election's unopposed?
True. You got to give the voters who really are trying to participate in the democratic process something to really care about, be passionate about, to come out and vote about.
Exactly.
And if you don't do that, and if you have a lackluster campaign or lackluster candidates that doesn't excite the base, that doesn't excite anybody, then you can get what you get, a low turnout.
Exactly.
But I think there's a bigger issue at stake here, and that's the issue of this thing about citizenship in a democracy.
Right.
It is at such a low tide, a low ebb, in that people don't even, I always say the 3 C's, your role as a citizen, your role as a constituent, and the last one I want to talk about, your role as a congregant. That last C, and I noticed you touched on it in your index, that last C has gotten kind of lost in this. And I go back to my era, in the first era of segregation. Those 3 C's meant something, and they worked in tandem with each other.
Right.
You as a citizen, you as a constituent in your local precinct, in your local neighborhood, in your local thing, were engaged and involved.
Right.
The same group of people were involved in your place of worship. When I say congregant, I mean a congregant. Church, parish, temple, synagogue, or mosque, Friday, Saturday, Sunday worship, doesn't matter, it's all the same.
Right.
You took your role and responsibility for each one of those 3 C's very seriously.
Right.
There was dialogue and conversation with your neighbor, with your peers, with your pew mates about what was going on. It's not happening today.
No, it doesn't. And this isn't in this study, but we tend to find that people, regardless of where they live, big city, small city, urban, rural, they tend to be about equally interested in national politics. But people who live in big cities tend to be a lot less interested in their local politics. And this is an issue because the local governments have, lots of very important powers, right? Really, the decisions being made in City Hall probably have a greater effect on your day-to-day life.
Oh, sure it does.
Than what's going on in D.C.
All politics is local, really local.
Exactly. All politics is local. You'll notice if your trash isn't picked up, your water is not running, right? It's a lot more effective than what's going on in D.C. But yeah, people just don't seem to be interested in local politics, and part of that might be sort of the defraying of local communities. People, their social networks are online or across the nation, right, rather than their neighbors, right, as we've been talking about. And because current, where we are right now, accepted, right, most media doesn't tend to focus on local politics, focus only on national politics.
But you touched on religion somewhere in the study, and that was I found that fascinating.
Sure.
Tell us about that.
Religion. So the CPS does ask, are you involved in a religious organization?
Right.
Now this is they make sure, like, this is more than just sitting in the pew.
Right, it's more than just a pew person.
Right, right. So to actually be involved in some other activity, right? And on this indicator, Houston's doing a bit better than the nation overall. Number 1 actually is Minneapolis, which I found somewhat surprising.
No, I lived and worked in Minneapolis. I don't find that surprising.
No? Okay, good.
You know why? Because the Lutherans are Catholics.
Oh, okay.
That's...
Sure. Yeah. So... Yeah, there is some religiosity, and people are doing more than just sitting in the pews.
Right, they are.
Better than the national average.
It's a very engaged community, very engaged, socially, economically, politically, very engaged.
Yes, absolutely.
And have a tradition of giving through the corporations, too.
Yeah.
The homegrown corporations particularly. But the religion thing that you just mentioned is interesting, because how does that translate during the weekday in service to your neighbor and helping your neighbor, even though you say I give, I attend, I tithe? But what about the other charitable help and giving? What about volunteerism is low? Charitable giving is low. Philanthropy is low. So if I do go and I say I care, is it that I'm not being reinforced in that worship hour in a segregated environment, as much as it may be, which it usually is, but I'm not being reinforced from the pulpit about what I need to be doing during the weekday?
That's hard for me to say.
We used to get that. We don't get that anymore.
No, it's hard for me to say. I don't know what's being said in most of the pulpits here in Houston. So hard for me to say, really.
I know I put you on the spot, but that was on purpose.
Sure.
Because whether it's being said or not, to the degree in which it's being encouraged and said, which in degree it's being connected to the role as the citizen, as the constituent, and as the congregant, those are not 3 separate lives.
No.
Those are the totality of the human being living out what a human being should be doing in relationship to another human being.
That's right. Yeah, it should be it's more than sitting in a pew and listening to a sermon for an hour.
Yeah.
It's more than even donating, when the collection plate comes by. This is not my study, but
it's very cool. The Pew Charitable Trust talks
Right.
about that very clearly.
Clearly, yeah. In fact, there was an interesting study a few years ago now that people who come back from a church service, right,
Right.
have donated their money to the collection plate, right, they tend to be less generous when they're tipping at their lunch or breakfast afterwards. So, I think there is a lack of carrying it over from the pews to the rest of their lives.
We have to stop here and pick up at another time some
Sure.
more, but thank you very much.
Thank you.
I just want to make a quick closing comment. It really is about how we tend to understand our roles and responsibilities and duties and obligations to each other. It's all about personal responsibility. It always comes back to personal responsibility. It's the question of don't tell me you love me, just show me you love me. In fact, use words only if necessary, because that's really what it boils down to. And so the talk, the rhetoric, the speeches, all those things we've been hearing so much about, it's the actions and behaviors. So quickly, if I got time real quick, draw a triangle, put the human being in the middle. At the top of the triangle, put relationships built on mutual trust and respect. To the right of the triangle, put commitment, accountability, and personal responsibility to each other as human beings. To the left of the triangle, put the issue of accountability and action. It's all about the action. You got to show me. You can't tell me. In every aspect of my life, my personal, professional, and public life, as a citizen, as a constituent, as a congregant, you have to really blend those together and be that total human being in service to other human beings. We have to get out of here. We thank you for being with us for this wonderful episode of Conversations. We look forward to you joining us in the future. And until then, peace and power.